Hello everyone, welcome to Cyberscoop TV. Greg Otto, your managing editor here. We're coming to you from the floor of the 2017 Black Hat Conference. And I'm talking with Jen Ellis, a VP from Rapid7. Jen, thanks for joining us today. So you do a lot with policy, and it's been quite a time to have discussions about policy. They've been happening all over the place this week. First up, let's talk about really the coalescing of an argument around cyber norms. Basically, there's been this idea that nation states need to get together and establish kind of a rule of law when it comes to engagement on cyber attacks, but then there are other people that are saying that there are certain actors out there that aren't going to listen to those norms, so why even bother? So I would love to know, your opinion on that, where you fall on that, and where you see the road moving forward.
So I think the challenge here is that internationally we want to have this global digital economy. We see the benefits of it. We want to have the economic stability of it, the economic growth, and we continue to want to govern that with nation-state approaches. And like, it's a natural tension, right? In that, if you're a government, on the one hand, you have a responsibility to create economic opportunity and growth and stability. On the other hand, you also need to think about all the other ways that you protect your citizens. And every government approaches that differently. You've got like the vast disparity between how Germany thinks about privacy and how the UK thinks about privacy, for example, and that's just within one region. You've got the massive cultural shift between, and obviously I'm British, so I talk about the UK a lot, but the relationship between public and private sector in the UK versus the relationship between public and private sector in the US. That's a huge cultural difference. So when these countries come together and they're trying to find a chord, it's incredibly challenging. I would say that like the defeatist approach of there's no point doing it because some people won't participate, like this is not new. Like, we've had to do this on various other things in the past. And it's always difficult to find a chord. And you could always take the approach of saying, well, some countries won't participate. It hasn't stopped there being accords built in other spheres and them being effective, even if the efficacy is perhaps limited in some ways, it's still worth doing. So I think we just have to keep finding ways forward, but I do think that it's extremely challenging and complex. There are no really good analogies. Like, there are no really, like, people always point to nuclear as being an example, or one of the ones I like is talking about health. So, World Health Organizations and infectious diseases organizations and that kind of thing. The challenge with that, and where the analogy breaks apart, is there's no real incentive for any country to be like, oh no, we really want infections to spread. Whereas with cybersecurity, there is an incentive for countries to not want to get on board. So it is a much harder problem, but like fundamentally it's a problem we have to solve. Because if we don't, every time we come at this story, we like hit this point of going, well, we'll just balkanize the internet, which seems like a massive step back.
We don't want that to happen.
So we have to find a way forward, and it is really challenging. I think one of the interesting things I've heard about is Microsoft has been working on this sort of like a digital Geneva Convention idea. And I think the notion that maybe the way to address this is to take it out of the government sphere and look at like the private sector organizations that are truly global, that are highly impactful globally, and think about how they can come together to create a groundswell and sort of effectively let like some free market forces drive this. I think that's very interesting, and it might be a more pragmatic way forward. The challenge that you then have is, do you end up going in a direction that is dictated by company interest rather than community interest?
And we've talked about this before on our site. We've had people write op-eds for similar structures where they would pull from both the government and the private sector, where you wouldn't have to deal with the government regulation side, but you also wouldn't have to move at the speed that Wall Street and the ethos as well, where you would have to basically grow by quarter by quarter by quarter. That's not really healthy for where we're trying to move in the cybersecurity realm.
Well, and the challenge that you have with cybersecurity as well is you need stability, but you also need the flexibility to grow because cybersecurity moves so fast. I mean, that's the problem we're having right now, is that we've gone from a point where society drove technological innovation to now technological innovation is driving society evolution. Sorry, too much Vegas. And so, we're at a point where the technology is moving faster than we can keep up with, and IoT is the perfect example of this. So
Right.
we look at it and we're like, okay, so we don't really fully understand yet exactly what all the implications can be, except that we know that we're woefully unprepared. We're actually behind where we need to be based on adoption of these technologies and the risk inherent in them. And we've seen this now hit us because of things like Mirai
Right.
coming up. And the bigger threat, the thing that like worries us even more beyond that, is that then you'll have situations where sort of cyber safety issues come into play, where you're dealing with automotive technologies, transport technologies, medical devices, critical infrastructure, and if we don't figure out how to solve these problems now, then we run the risk of getting into a situation where we have a knee-jerk reaction to a terrible incident.
Right.
And that's the worst outcome. And we don't want that.
Speaking of, a knee-jerk reaction to a terrible incident, I mean,
Yep.
hacking back. I
Yep.
mean, the possibility, there's a bill moving
Yep.
through the U.S. right now that would give companies the ability to hack back. That brings an entirely new
Yeah.
dynamic to this cyber norms that we talk about.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly on the bill that Congressman Graves has proposed, the ACDC Act, Highway to Hell, it's actually relatively limited. In fact, I would say it's actually quite limited in what
Okay.
it does. It really looks at authorizing activities related to attribution, and it creates a carve-out specifically in the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The problem with the term hackback is it's incredibly vast. And so like we have a definition that we use, which is it's private sector action. It is action taken specifically in response to cyber action taken against you. And there's action taken on assets, technological assets that you do not manage, own, or lease.
Okay.
Right? And that's how we define it. But within that, that's still incredibly broad. On the one end of the spectrum, you could have something like beaconing, where you put something in your data, and when that data gets stolen, it sends messages back. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got implanting something that's actually malicious that will cause damage. And so, what Mr. Graves' bill does is looks much more at the sort of beaconing end of the spectrum and much less at the malicious damage. I think most people feel like that's a bad way to go.
Okay.
But we lack this sort of narrow enough focus, and what the bill, where I think the bill particularly falls down is there are an awful lot of things that get levied against why hackback's a bad idea. Attribution being a problem, controlling the impact being a problem, creating a worse poverty divide and security being a problem, managing motivation, stopping abuses, like there's so many problems.
Right.
The bill does nothing to address any of those. It doesn't talk about what a pragmatic oversight framework would look like at all. And let's not forget that, when the government takes action, they have a massive oversight framework that they have to adhere
Right.
to. And so like any proposal for the private sector that would in any way be viable has to address how we would make oversight work and make it functional and protect accidental victims.
Right. So switching focus now, there has been such a groundswell of conversation over the U.S. government's push to make voting machines a critical infrastructure. And
Yeah.
a lot of people look at this as a reaction to the 2016 election and say
Which
that
it
the
is.
election
Yeah.
that the election was
Yeah.
hacked.
Yeah.
But we were talking before we started this interview about how that there's almost too much noise around this right now. In
Yeah.
that calling it a hacked election is kind of false.
Yeah, I mean, I think, let's put it this way.
Not false,
You
but,
could
like,
call it a hacked
misguided.
election in the same way that you could call any election a hacked election, right? Any election probably has some element of social engineering.
Yeah, right, okay.
Manipulation, information manipulation. I'm sure that this has happened for years. The way that they did it in this case gives a much sort of stronger flavor of cyber attack because of the DNC attack. I think with voting machines, there seems to be almost a bit of a misunderstanding. It's like people seem to think that these voting machines are like connected to the internet and people are voting through them, and that if you hack them, you can like flood them with like votes in one direction or another, and that's how you're influencing. And that's not what happens at
Right.
all. The way that it works is you have to go into a polling station, and then you can hack the voting machine in that polling station, and you can influence that single voting machine, and you could send somebody into a different polling station. They could influence the single voting machine that they hack, and that's a really, really inefficient way of hacking an election. The way that the influence was spread in the 2016 election is a much more effective way of doing it.
Right.
And so, I think voting machine security is important. I think any security is important. I think that we certainly would want to know where there are risks in voting machines and try and protect them. But I think that sort of having this sense of them as being like this oversimplified view that you can just like hack a voting machine and massively change the outcome of election is just not, it's not real.
Okay, definitely, and that's what I was getting at. Not so much at its faults, but it is misguided that there are people walking in with renegade USB sticks and just sending election totals wildly off base.
Yeah, I mean, as a Brit, I don't get a vote, so maybe that's how I should get my vote. No, I'm US government, I'm kidding, I would never do that.
Jen, appreciate your insight.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
For all of our videos, check out our YouTube channel, and for more on Black Hat and all things cybersecurity, check out cyberscoop.com. I'm Greg Otto. Thanks for watching.